I'd just come home from work, and I was really tired. I got a phone call from what looked like John's number, and I picked up and I thought, oh, that's a woman, that's a bit strange. So it was one of the nurses, and the first thing she said to me was, "Don't worry, but your husband's in A&E unconscious." My stomach dropped. I froze. I was so surprised. And I went down to the hospital to see if I could help and to find out what happened. As far as I knew, he'd been at work, and I thought he was still there, so I was really shocked. He'd been found unconscious by a member of the public and brought in by ambulance. When I got to the hospital, I wanted to check that he was still there. So after wandering around the hospital lost for what seems like hours, I kept calling him. I kept thinking maybe he'll answer his phone and tell me what's going on, but no answer. I found out he's still in the A&E department, so I went over there and I spoke to the receptionist. She said I couldn't see him because of COVID measures, and she couldn't tell me what had happened. They didn't know what had happened, and he hadn't been seen by a doctor. They kept telling me that they'd call me when they had more information, as did the nurse, but nobody ever called me. I never spoke to a medical professional that day, which could have been so much better. The receptionist told me to wait in my car, but I didn't know where the car was. My husband had the car before he was brought into hospital. So I just went outside and sobbed and called my dad. It would have been much better that day if I'd been able to speak to a doctor or a medical professional. And nobody spoke to John about his addiction that day or spoke to me when he was released to go home. There was no indication of anything that I should look for. Because he'd hit his head, I was still quite concerned, but they just said, OK, take him home. There was no follow-up, there was no letter to the GP, there was no connection with addiction services at all. It was an awful experience, but it could have been made much better if there was something like a 24-hour helpline in A&E where people might turn up with addictions, or some sort of liaison with an addiction specialist who could then follow up when they were in a better headspace or if they were sober. That would make a massive improvement to the addicts and to the families of the addicts, and I think could even save the taxpayer money by treating the problem, not just sort of dealing with it when it comes up time and time again and letting the cycle start again. I think the stigma for addiction is really strong, and it affects loved ones as much as it does addicts themselves. I think people don't want to admit that there is a problem, either themselves or for someone else. I think that stigma puts people off accessing support and help. If it was more visible how many people are affected by someone else's addiction, then I think that would reduce the stigma and make people realise that it's not as uncommon as you think. You're not alone. You won't be judged. There's lots of other people in similar situations who can help you. I think it would be useful if addiction services and services for people who care for an addict were more linked with mental health services and health services themselves. I think it's a barrier in that everything's treated so separately rather than in a holistic way, and I think there would be less stigma if addiction was treated as a medical condition and treated in a healthcare setting rather than an independent setting. It's really hard using the word carer. It's taken me some time to get used to that, and it's perhaps not the first place that people would look for help. At first, you mainly want help for the addict. You think that that's what needs to change. You don't think about helping yourself. So it would be good to have sort of signposting when the addict first gets referred to help for the loved one as well. I'd like it if more people accessed the service, if it was more visible or sort of frequently signposted to people that might need it. I know there's lots of people affected by other people's addictions, so I'd like as many people to get help as possible.